Hello and welcome to Talking General Practice, the podcast from GP Online. I'm Emma Bower, the editor of GP Online. Coming up on the podcast today, I'm speaking to Dr Katie Bramall, the chair of the BMA's GP committee in England. In this conversation, Katie talks about the current dispute with the government over online access changes. She responds to that recent letter sent to GPs by Health and Social Care Secretary Wes Streeting, which accused her of unprofessional behaviour and misleading the profession over those contract changes. And she explains why she believes trust between the profession and the government has evaporated. Katie also talks about the next steps in the dispute, explaining why there's no immediate plans for a ballot on industrial action, and discusses her concerns about the 10-year health plan and what this could all mean for future GP contracts. If you're listening to this podcast, you know just how fast general practice is moving. To keep up, you need more than just headlines. A GP Online subscription gives you expert analysis on the latest news affecting general practice and how it impacts on you. A subscription to GP Online also gives you access to MIMS for prescribing information and MIMS Learning to help you complete your CPD. It's your daily briefing and your education platform in one. Subscribe now at GPonline.com. I'm really delighted to welcome onto the podcast now someone who needs really no introduction. Is Dr Katie Bramall, who is the chair of the England BMA GP committee. Thank you for coming on the podcast, Katie.
Thank you for having me, Emma. It's really nice to see you.
Well, it's a very difficult and challenging time at the minute. The GP committee is in dispute with the government over the changes to online access. You're about to take part in a series of webinars to explain to GPs exactly what has led to this point and what happens next. So firstly, let's look at what's gone wrong, really. You said the government has broken promises relating to online access. The government has said the BMA is misleading the profession with those claims. What's your view on what was specifically promised, and in what way do you believe the government's breached that promise?
So at the start of the year, we were told the red line for Wes Streeting is being able to go online and book an appointment. And very quickly, as you'd imagine, we said, there isn't really the technical ability to be able to do that with the current online consult tools. That will need to be built in a way. Patients don't present normally with, I need an appointment for this specific reason. They can say, right, I'm due my cervical smear, for example, but it's very much a minority of patient requests. Let's be honest, patients present with symptoms, or most commonly a range of symptoms and a number of problems. And so we kind of went through what this would require. What's interesting and what's of note is that obviously we're all in practice, we're all very au fait with various different online consult tools. We've got an experience of a few between us. The other side haven't really been in practice since the pandemic. And I think all of us would reflect that as a job, in terms of the day-to-day functionality, it is unrecognisable from 2019 in terms of everything that we've got now and the way that we work. So that became quite clear. And we want to try and help this work. We want to, if we can, have a much better relationship with this new government. They'd recognised significant investment. Of course, alongside that was the increased costs coming from the autumn financial statement on employers' national insurance contributions. However, this was still quite a large uplift. They'd also given quite a significant uplift on the back of 2024's DDRB as well. We felt that if there was going to be fruitfulness to try and negotiate a new GMS contract, that chance, that single opportunity for that generational, transformational investment, it was going to be with the government. So we wanted to try and help them land something. And I think what's happened is you've got the minister's red lines coming up against NHS England's ideology of modern general practice access and the total triage model and the digital front door and all of that kind of stuff. It kind of hit in a bit of a conflict between them both in terms of those two ideologies working out. Throughout, we have been completely consistent, and we absolutely did agree the contract at GPC England. There was a vote in favour. It was about 75%. And the committee were really clear It was based upon 3 contingencies. One was around having necessary safeguards, and that phrase that was agreed, it's safeguards plural, it's not just a pop-up or a line in you and your GP would have agreed that. So I think there's an element of over-promising and under-delivering on that side. They will say they haven't misled us, that's where we are. The qualitative notes, the contemporaneous notes at the same time as those meetings and discussions very much was around going to the online providers. We knew that if we just went on our own, they're going to say, well, hang on, what does NHS England say? So this needed to be a conversation around the table together. The other thing I'd say is that in their world of saying, no, this is what it always was and this is what we're going to say because words mean what words say. And if they've managed to get one over on us, well, more fool us, frankly. But actually, I've always been taught that if a negotiation is unequal and if one party comes away feeling they've been lied to or betrayed or let down, trust evaporates. And this is where we find ourselves. Now, they might think that what we were saying was hyperbole, and actually, we're really cool with online consults. We deliver millions every day. We have them for months, in some cases years. This is all about the implementation, how it is done, and the wording around it, and then coming in hard on the back of it around everything else with hours and access, and trying to promise so much for the public with a government under immense pressure. And it's much, much easier to target and to hone in to these little tiny battles in an interview and say big bad BMA than it is to actually tackle the truth, which is, well, hang on, when you've got emerging stroke symptoms or a heart attack coming through a change of address online or a non-urgent platform, that is a concern. Just like how we're seeing now with devastating pathological diagnoses being revealed on the NHS app. We warned about that. But this is much larger. This is impacting everybody. No GP, no practice is against online access. The GPC isn't. And it's interesting that that's how it's being twisted and painted. And in fact, their line changed. So it was, we'd work together to assure these safeguards. And then it was, well, GPC England will do it. And then it was, well, practices need to do it. They kept on shifting in all of their dialogue, in all their letters. We've stayed the same. Really, all this comes down to is patient safety. So I think people are over the wording. We're now just wanting government to work with us on what's happening now with patients. And the survey we did, over 1,200 practices came back to us in just over a week. That's, you're almost 15 million patients worth of practices across the country with really clear data, with some really excellent qualitative data sets. And that's what we'd like to sit and go through with government to help them understand, actually, we've got this. How can we make this a success? How can we make it safer for patients, feel much safer for practices and the well-being of staff as well? Isn't that a better place to be in than this adversarial point scoring? It feels reductionist and it feels like it's very much not in the interests of practices or patients. It feels like it's just trying to score political points to play out, to attract voters, to improve policies and polls in the public. And it's all going to come to naught fundamentally because, as I've said before, if you open another lane in the motorway, claiming, isn't this marvellous, you can get to your destination more quickly, but actually you get onto the motorway and you realise it's all jammed as well. And actually they didn't widen the motorway. There's no difference. And the public and patients will get that because they're at risk of taking what should be or what could be a good news story about how phenomenally adaptive general practice is and trying to turn it into this binary black and white anti-BMA. I don't see how this is going to work out long term for Wes Streeting. He might feel that it's doing really well at the moment, but I do worry longer term. I think it's going to come back. And we're still going to be here wanting to have those conversations and wanting to keep practices safe.
You just said a minute ago that you agreed the contract on the basis that there would be meetings with suppliers to sort out the online access side of things, including with the DH. Obviously, we've seen a letter that they wrote to you saying that the contract was agreed without any dependency on solutions from system suppliers. Is it just a case of miscommunication, missed wires? Why are they saying that and you're saying something different?
If you look at all of the background notes in those meetings, you're trying to get to a statement that both parties are content with, that isn't going to go into loads and loads of detail. This all happens in a very pressure cooker environment in the last day or so. This actually straddled a weekend. It was Friday. There were calls on Saturday and Sunday. It was Monday when I was in surgery. It was actually the last day when things were being done, and the same is true for the others as well. They're in surgery. It's deliberately squeezed and pushed into the last minute because that's just the style. That's the way that the government tends to do business, has done for a great many years. And so you're trying to get to a statement or a form of words that both parties can be content with. If you want to be legal about it, then you could say, well, hang on, it says safeguards plural, necessary safeguards, not just one thing that the government are now saying. And in what world would we have said, yeah, that's okay, that's no problem? Because clearly it wasn't. So there was this space where we were around the table. And please, let's also focus. It wasn't just online consultations. It was also GP Connect Update Record, right access, and working with the joint GPIT committee. And exactly the same thing has happened there. And the joint GPIT committee isn't a political committee. It's made up of RCGP members and BMA members who primarily want IT innovation to be safe, to be adopted, to be slick, to work for patients. And these are a really keen bunch of guys that want to get stuff done and work phenomenally well and are incredibly well considered. It's a committee that's been in existence for a great many years and has been immensely influential over that time and really provides a free resource to the DH and NHS England, kind of going, what do you want to do? Let us tell you how that can be done. They were immensely frustrated. And so we had to kind of enter those conversations around kind of June, July time. And that's when it starts to dawn on us that we were being timed out here. And that's really disappointing. The Joint GPIT committee put out that recommendations paper about this is what is needed with GP Connect Update Record. And I can see that people struggle to find it interesting or exciting. It's actually incredibly important. It is just as important as online consultations in terms of third parties having right access into the GP record and the data controllership issues therein. And the third thing was a new contract. And we wrote in June, July, wrote again in September. And there has been no discourse about that. We've had nothing in writing about the new contract. What we have had is the 10-year plan, elucidating the single and the multi-neighbourhood provider contracts. We're told there's going to be more detail about neighbourhood models coming to us before Christmas, but we have nothing. So let's not let them off the hook for everything else as well. And there's a theme of consistency across all those three areas, where we're still wanting and we're still asking and we've been consistent and the other side sadly have not. That's not to say they couldn't be. This is all remedial and that's what's so frustrating. But they'd rather have an argument over a word in a sentence than step back and go, okay, what's in the best interest for the profession? It's having a mutually beneficial relationship with the GPC. They're sensible, they're pragmatic, they're experienced, let's work with them. But it's a real red flag to me to be labelled a liar. My integrity is everything. I'm a GP. And that's the same is true for Samira and Julius and David. So if you're having to resort to that kind of castigation, then it makes me think, well, it's because you're trying to hide the failures elsewhere as well. And that's what I'd encourage my colleagues and peers to think about dispassionately and critically.
Because obviously last week it was quite unprecedented in a way that Wes Streeting wrote to GPs and he accused you personally of deeply unprofessional behaviour, misrepresenting what's happened in contract negotiations. He really took issue with your speech at the LMC's conference. That must be quite difficult having, the Secretary of State writing to all of your professional colleagues and saying that. I mean, how have you coped with that?
It was timing. So it was being sent on the day that GPC England was meeting. So that was deliberate, first of all, to sow distrust and division, because he knows there's elements in the committee that would like to see me gone and they think they can do a better job, and good luck to them. That's fine. I'm very happy for them to have a go, but they might have to just wait until my turn's finished. We've also got the budget the previous day, and they were still not talking to us. They did make overtures once GPC had finished, so later that evening, to BMA staff. So there's a lot of politics playing out here, intentional politics. And I kind of feel that The reason Wes Streeting is singling me out is because in my speech to the LMC conference, which was the morning after the Traitors Celebrity Final had broadcast, I made the allusion that the government had been traitors, that I was faithful, I have not misled the profession. And I recall Wes Streeting as well, when he was under all pressure from Number 10 and the leaks and the briefings, he trotted out a similar kind of line about faithfuls and traitors. But interestingly, he's chosen to lift that out 3 weeks later in that letter. And he's written some pretty strong things against me. And I think, well, if that's all he's got, then that's challenging. Because I've written to him and it's in the public domain. It's on the bma.org.uk/GP contract. Every single formal letter along the entire way is there for colleagues to have a look at. And I think he's done a really good job of galvanising the profession. I don't think it's in the way he intended to. I've been really heartened by a lot of support that people are going, no, that is what we think. You think that's just her. It's not. She's saying what we think. And what I said to the LMC conference, and this is the LMC conference, it's a hall packed full of LMC members, self-selected and elected GPs interested in the politics. And it was very much a story arc. It was a narrative. It was how did we get from here to here? Because the last time I stood and spoke to them all was the special conference where I was able to go, well, here's the letter saying we're committing to a new practice contract. We'll work with GPC England. It will be delivered within this Parliament. And that's exactly what we needed. And that helped us accept the contract. And now I'm standing in front of the same audience again, 7 months later, and it all seems to have been in disarray. Well, how did you get from A to B? And so my speech was pretty much how we got from A to B. And it was explaining all of the changes in the background, what led to the 10-year plan being produced in the way that it was, who is influencing the Secretary of State. And of course, I named the appointment of a number of civil servants in that. And I think that they feel aggrieved that it was individuals that were being highlighted and they don't have a right of reply because they're not elected public officials. And I think that's a fair point. However, when you're referencing some people on the NHS England board who are journalists in broadsheet papers and who regularly write op-eds, slightly tenuous in terms of them not having a right of reply. But nevertheless, there was nothing pejorative stated about any of those individuals. It was simply a matter of public record. And what I said that I suspect really pressed their buttons was, you see, doesn't matter who you vote for, the government always gets back in. And they're very much at pains to want to paint themselves as being very different from how things have gone. But we also have to recognise there's been quite a battle within the DH and NHS England. It was going to be a DH takeover, but actually DH is the minnow and NHS England is the whale, because DH has got about 2,500 staff, NHS England about 15,000. And there's been an awful lot of jostling there for ideology, for positions, for policies that we have seen play out. And a lot of it was around the 10-year plan. If they're having to come to just attack me in a pejorative sense, and he's having to feel the need to write to every GP, what else has he got? It suggests to me there's nothing left. There's nothing left to explain what they're doing other than just trying to say, oh, I don't like your leader very much. I'm your democratically elected leader. I'm terribly sorry. And I believe I'm saying what GPs think and feel out there because that is my job. I'm looking to try and make things better and safer for the profession. And if the GPs support me, that is everything I need. And people have been very kind in that support.
There has been some criticism from some quarters, a suggestion that maybe the GP committee might need new leadership. But we've talked on our podcast a lot about the fact that the government doesn't seem to be listening to GPs, because it wasn't just you that was warning about problems to do with online consultation. It was actually, the grassroots GPs, people on the front line have all said this is going to cause problems, all said it has caused problems. Do you think a change of leadership would make any difference, or is the government just not listening to GPs?
When you have a change of leadership, there's always a new opportunity to reset the platform. At the moment, they're starting the consultation process for next year's contract. I think it would be immensely damaging if I were to go, do you know what? This is just too much. I'm not getting anywhere. I am having everybody throw all sorts of stones at me. this is intolerable. And there are days that you can feel like that because you're human. And I'm always transparent. I'm always honest. But there's a time and a place. The end of my term is in July. It'll be 3 years since we were elected. And that's an opportunity to then have an election to determine who the new team are going to be, whether it's people continuing in role or whether it's people joining the role anew. And that's your window for a fresh opportunity. The only thing I see changing in the next 6 months is potential imposition of a contract because of the way they've changed and moved away from the traditional negotiation consultation cycle that's been in place since 2004. In this contract and beyond in other contracts, we'll have Cahill reporting from the King's Fund and the NIHR. And again, that's meant to be a fixed funding envelope, which will be a disaster. As I said at conference, that's going to be MPIG Mark II. We're going to have much more detail around the neighbourhood model proposals, but at the same time, we're going to probably see the 18-week elective target dropped because it's going nowhere. We can see trusts continuing to accrue deficit because they're not going to suddenly achieve financial balance. I think we're going to start to see the wheels come off an awful lot of these policies. The crying shame here is that we genuinely wanted to get something done with this government. We saw it as a genuine big opportunity. You've got the same civil servants in roles, you've got that continuity, and some of them might have a very strong ideology which doesn't match yours, for example. And I think that will always be a problem. Certainly in terms of there's a small faction within GPC England. They've got different ideas between them and different reasons for that motivation. But for quite a lot of it, it's self-interest. And I think people struggle when you're not acting in self-interest to understand what's your motivation, because surely you must be just like me. But I don't think the government are going to find it any more fruitful with whoever potential future election. We don't know. I think that they need to understand where they've got certainty and where they've got continuity and where they could potentially do a deal and where they could have some off-ramps that are in the interest of the profession and also themselves. Because the longer things go on, the more pressure they're going to be under because they'll approach a general election, and the more the polls are going to be potentially adverse, or the more destabilised practices will be if they persist with their policies. And it's not going to work. It's going to come unstuck. So it would be nice to help these guys out of a hole because only they have the key to the door. And we have to recognise that. You can shout and you can bang on that door as much as you like with posturing and political grandstanding. But actually, unless you can talk, unless you can negotiate and find a way to get people to open the door, you're going to make no progress whatsoever. And that's what people need to understand. This kind of like shouting and putting out op-eds and the rest of it. And the same is true for Mr. Streeting. It's not going to get him anywhere. And it's why I think it's probably going to change quite soon and he'll be moving on to something different. But I do think he will continue to take the BMA whenever he can around resident action, around potential ballots for consultants and SAS doctors, because it's much easier in an interview to be reductionist and frame this as a big bad trade union blocking progress when he wants to be the brave reformer than it is to be put on the spot answering questions as to why has the government had to drop the 18-week target, why are trusts accruing deficit, why still can't patients get through to actually have an appointment. So I think we'll see more and more and more of trying to target the BMA in particular. And so that's just bad news for those of us in BMA roles, unfortunately, but it goes with the job. It's what you know you're signing up for when you do it.
Will you stand again to be chair in July if that's when the elections are going to come round?
I promised myself that I wouldn't make a decision until we've got this contract out the way. So I'm not letting myself get distracted by anything to do with that.
We've found out about all these changes to the contracts that normally in days gone by, there'd be negotiations, you'd go in, you'd meet them, there'd be discussions about what's going to be in the contract. They've said this year they're going to do a consultation and you will be one of a number of people that they will consult with. What do you think that's going to mean for next year's contract? I mean, you've basically said, and people we've spoken to suggested it basically means in position. It's not necessarily going to be an agreed contract with the BMA. But what do you think it will mean about what will be in the contract?
This could potentially be quite a difficult contract for the profession. And the way to avoid the political fallout of the term in position, because look how much they've dined out on the fact it was agreed, is to broaden the scope as a consultation. I mean, they consult every year with the college, with NAPC, with Confed. national voices with Health Watch, with the Patients Association. They consult far and wide, that's fine, and they'll continue to do that. They'll continue to deal with Just Us around changes to the SFE, the Statement of Financial Entitlements. But I suspect it will be, you can go in and have a chat and then you go out, and then you go in and have a chat and then you go out. And I suspect they will say, well, we're going to listen to you very carefully and we'll reflect on the feedback, and then we're going to carry on doing what we want to do anyway. And in terms of what I think is going to be in the contract, I don't think there are going to be big changes, but I do think it's going to be very much along the lines of maturing the neighbourhood model and that kind of shift from PCN to neighbourhood, which I think will be quite subtle in terms of nuance, but there'll be some contractual levers there, I suspect. I also wonder if they might try and tidy up some of the online access stuff. My worry is they'll make it more rigid. They might surprise me and make it more flexible, which I think would be very wise. We'll just have to wait and see. And as usual, they normally consult widely across clinical groups in terms of QOF changes and the rest. So we'll just have to see. My hunch is they are nowhere near anything for a single neighbourhood provider contract from April. That rumour that was swirling around at Labour Party conference of taking the baskets of locally commissioned services and taking them away from practices and commissioning them through single neighbourhood provider contracts. Well, if that is true, and I've not seen it written down anywhere, but if that, for example, were true, you'd need to give 6 months' notice on those contracts. So I believe they'd be working up to doing big stuff in April 27. So it wouldn't surprise me if actually it's quite pared down for 26-27 and they're going to try and get it a bit more stabilised. But again, we're going to have to wait and see. We'll get the detail imminently.
You are in dispute with the government now. And so what happens next? Will there be a ballot? What are you going to do? What are the next steps in this dispute with the government?
So it's really interesting, Emma. I was in Aberdeen last week for the Scottish LMC conference, and it was a very different atmosphere because Scottish GPC has just agreed a package with the Scottish government of around 250 million over the next 3 years. And what that is an evidence-based pilot to demonstrate that practices can use that money to invest in workforce, to provide additional services and transform how they work. And it's not about income. What's so interesting is that Scotland adopted our manifesto and it adopted our safe working guidance. Now, Samira and myself were really flattered by that. I think where you can have that four-nation consensus, it makes everyone's argument stronger. So we've been really happy to see that. The reason why I'm talking about Scotland is that they went into dispute, I think, in May with the Scottish government. They have played a much longer game around explaining what their actions are going to be, doing very much what we did in 2024 with collective actions, doing the road shows, doing webinars, doing blogs, putting out supportive campaign material. And they recognised what a lot of political commentators will tell you in terms of leverage and action, where the greatest leverage in a contract like ours is actually in that phase where you announce a dispute and you threaten action. Action itself, the leverage can drop once you start it. We're in a very different scenario in England, and timing is everything. And when you're approaching winter pressures, when practices are trying to get their heads around the regulatory changes, the contract variation changes still, now is not the time to be saying, right, guys, okay, assemble, road shows, you name it, because it's the middle of winter. What there is a need for, which I think I've articulated, is the potential to start getting the workforce to understand the narrative. What has led us to this point? Where are we now? What is likely in the future? And yeah, we've had some really helpful, very spicy, very strong resolutions come out of England Conference. It's one thing coming out of England Conference, it's another getting the profession to do something in the numbers required to make it happen. And that's why I think there needs to be that warming up, that simmering, so everyone can genuinely understand. Now, what happens is up to the profession, but my responsibility is to make sure they are the most informed, the most receptive they can be. They can understand, well, what actions could we take? and then what would happen? And what actions would we be most likely to take? And then what would happen? And how can we potentially also leverage and bring our patients with us? How strategically would it make sense to try and also align the interests of salaried GPs? Because I think we've got an increasing variance whereby we've got two main interests at play, broadly speaking. One, I think, is the interests of practice sustainability, and the other is the interests of the individual GP and their career and where that's going. And to ignore one is to ignore both of them. So I think both have to be taken. We've also got to recognise that certainly in terms of BMA membership and in terms of the workforce, it's quite even between contractors, principals, partners on the one side and salaried GPs on the other. And they've got very different views. A salaried GP, I think, is not that likely to take action, significant action, unless they understand what the benefit's going to be to their contract. And so we're going to need to find where those two Venn diagrams intersect. Now, the good news is we've got two incredibly formidable co-chairs of the BMA Sessional GP Committee. We've got Amy Small and Kim Rollinson. Both used to hold contracts. Both are very experienced partners in the past, now salaried GPs, and they understand the contract, but they understand salaried GPs. We've got to listen to what the focus groups are going to tell us when they report back. We've got to get out there talking to the profession, get really excellent legal advice to help reassure contractors and salaried GPs alike, because if you're going to take a form of action in a job market where people are clamouring for job roles, you're going to want to know that you're being protected. And you kind of want to do a sort of display where, yeah, I'm taking action, but actually my employer is supporting me here because my employer are the partners. So this is actually focusing on government. You don't want it to turn into internal division. And as GPs, we're quite good at doing internal division. Again, it's going to take quite a bit of political nuance and effort to get everything shining in the right direction to put that headlight and target onto Mr. Streeting to bring him to the table. But sadly, it would be a shame to have to ramp all that up because it would be much easier just to talk. And of course, ramping up action, I suspect to a certain extent, is what the Secretary of State would like, because I think anything involving industrial action again enables him to basically say bleh to the BMA in front of interviews, because that makes much easier life for him. As ever, with general practice, it's complicated, but there's a lot of work to do. And I think a plan is starting to formulate, but I'm not going to go into immense detail now because things can change on a sixpence, as we've seen over the recent weeks.
So basically, no ballot imminent. You're working up plans for how that might look and work in discussion with lots of people. That's what's happening at the moment.
If you were to take a statutory ballot for salaried GPs to breach their contract, you'd need to have an indicative ballot first. This is trade union law. And before indicative ballots, you've got to make sure your membership is cleansed and you've done your appropriate due diligence with advertising that. The building blocks here are very necessary and urgently required around helping explain to everybody what's really going on here. Because you can look at online access in isolation. Actually, that would be a mistake. You need to look at the whole project around the digital front door, around triage as the model, around breaking continuity, understanding actually what's the long-term aim here. And I suspect it's turning general practice very much into more of a sort of triage, digital front door, 111 quasi service. That is not general practice. That is not what we trained to deliver. That's not the specialty we love. And this, I think, is turning into something a bit more existential. And we have a moral and ethical duty to let our patients know what's happening as well.
One of the things that you said in your speech to the LMC's conference is that you saw no prospect of any transformational investment to support a major new contract, which the government has promised. And Wes Streeting has said again that he does want to deliver that in this Parliament. What do you think is going to happen with this new contract? Are you hopeful about that in the future, or do you believe the government's prepared to invest in core general practice or not?
What's interesting is if you look at Scotland, the funding for the Scottish package has come from the health budget. It is not new money. So it's going to have to be found from the acutes. Now, the challenge in England, when you scale that up much more, is profound. They are still talking about a new contract and what that would look like. But I don't think we're in the right headspace. And the other thing to learn, because I was in Northern Ireland at the start of the month at their conference and all the discussions around looking at the Republic of Ireland and what happens there. We had a wonderful guest speaker, Matthew O'Foyland from the Irish Medical Organisation. And he said, you need to be patient. You need to wait until the person you're doing a deal with has got pounds in their pocket. You don't do a negotiation with someone who's broke. And so we might actually need to be patient. As I said at conference, they very much want a new contract, but would it be a contract you'd want to sign? That's also really important. There was an opportunity there. There's money being spent. Don't get me wrong. We've seen the budget, the money, 300 million for this and that and the NHS app. There is money that could transform. How it's spent and when it's spent and where it is spent is ideological. And we are trying all we can to make that case. But ultimately, if you've got 100 people whispering in the ear saying, no, actually invest it in this, then it makes your challenge all the harder. So I think general practice is in a really, really difficult space. And I think we're all going to have to think much more laterally, much more cleverly around what we're going to be doing in terms of our next steps.
The dispute on the face of it, on the top of it, is about online consultations. But obviously that's not happening in a vacuum. It's happening alongside the 10-year plan. And there's lots of concerns about the direction of travel from GPs under this 10-year plan. The government has said that the partnership model should continue where it's successful. But do you think the government is genuinely supportive of that model? And if not, why not?
Stephen Kinnock said a number of times the two most important things to him are social equity and continuity of care. Now, where you find the best continuity of care is in smaller practices. Where you find the greatest patient satisfaction is in smaller practices. Where partnership is working well, I think, is kind of trying to say if you're too big to fail, if you're being delivered at scale and so on. And that can work well for some people in some communities, and there are some really good examples, but it's not everywhere, and it can't be everywhere. And we have got some phenomenal smaller practices doing incredible work. And why should they be tainted as failing? They're not failing. The structures around them have changed to make it impossible for them to succeed. Now, I think there's a duty on us as a profession, there's a duty, I think, on federations where they exist to try and support smaller practice models to be able to offer that more nuanced approach. The government talk about rurality and the importance of social inequalities. Well, it's very difficult to offer that big-scaled model in rural geographies. So much of the ideology that's being espoused doesn't actually make sense on the ground. So I would challenge some of these things. I think there's a big problem, and that's actually what Treasury thinks and sees and what the Department of Health thinks and sees, and NHS England, when they look at earnings and expenses. And they look and see what contractors are drawing across England, and they'll compare it to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. They'll also compare the gap between contractors and salaried GPs. And the widest gap that's widening is in England. And we've just seen Scotland vote at their LMC conference to mandate all of DDRB uplifts being passed on. The England conference in November, the same. So I think we need to be much more intelligent around calling for investment in workforce. And new money needs to be, if it's ring-fenced around reimbursements, to employ more GPs or to uplift the pay of existing salaried GPs, sign me up, because I think we've got to also protect the future of general practice. And it's no good if partner numbers dwindle, and it's no longer because there's nobody willing to join the partnerships. I think there are people now really keen to tread that path. The issue is that, quite understandably, because the years have seen such income variation and contractual uncertainty, and the expenses mechanism is so flawed, as we saw with inflation around the end of the pandemic, that partners are very anxious around seeing their reserves vanish, and so they are terribly conservative in their choices. And they have then, because of human nature, got used to drawing from a 2, 3 or 4 partnership rather than a 5, 6, 7 or whatever. Unfortunately, that then becomes a barrier to increasing the partnership. But increase it, we have got to. So if you look at the Red Book contract prior to the GMS 2004, payments were dependent upon how many partners you had. And there's something there about the GP to patient ratio. If you've got 1 or 2 GPs covering over 100,000 patients, is that really the model of general practice that we want to cherish and save and look after? We want it to be GP-led, and this is what Scotland have done, and this is what we put in our England manifesto a couple of years ago. Get that GP-patient ratio down, bring back continuity of care. Don't get distracted by if you're at scale or if you're small. Focus on it being GP-led. We saw the PCN DES and all of that influx of money around the additional roles reimbursement scheme. Well, really, ostensibly, that was so they could demonstrate investment that they knew was going to go into workforce, that they knew would not be divided into partner income. And we need to learn the lessons from that. And it does come down to a breaking of trust. So we need to see what's working well in Scotland that we have already articulated and continue to bang that drum of reimbursement. And that's why, certainly with Julius and Samira, David and myself, we've gone in for reimbursement all along because we see that as the long-term benefit here. We've got to drive up the income of salaried GPs because the way things are going, if we start to get these integrated health organisations or you start to get trusts taking over and you've set the earning and you've set the contractual terms too low for those expert generalists, everyone is losing. There's lessons for the future to learn from the past.
There's a lot in the 10-year plan that's a cause for concern for GPs. I mean, what do you think the biggest threat for general practice is in all of this? Is it just this whole new neighbourhood model and the new neighbourhood contracts? Are those the biggest things that GPs should be worried about, or is there anything else in there that's a worry?
We have concerns, of course, over many of the things in the 10-year plan. That's not news. It's the lack of evidence base. It's the lack of impact assessment. So many things. If it's the case that there is no money, that the economy continues to be a real challenge, we are stuck with NHS income every year being in the region of 2.6%, but CPI is sitting at 3.6%, then there is zero money for transformation. And the transformation that's being articulated in the 10-year plan requires huge investment. It has been done. You've only got to look at Denmark, who shifted from 60% of the funding going to hospitals to 40% of the funding. So it can be done, but it's painful and it requires pump priming primary care. And we are not seeing the pump priming. We're seeing all of the leftward shift of workload, nothing to do with resource. And I don't see how that's going to get trusts with sufficient financial headspace to wash their own face. I don't see how it's going to do anything other than paralyse general practice. So actually, I think rather than any transformation, the biggest risk is paralysis. That we don't change, the system doesn't change, because the status quo is the partnership model numbers going down and down and down and down and down. The practice model is practices numbers going down and down and down and down and down. The employment model is for salaried GPs going up and for underemployment in general practice going up and up and up because there's no workforce planning and they've already bumped the latest reiteration of the long-term workforce plan into probably kind of April time. That's the danger here. The danger is paralysis in an absence of an economy that's able to really do anything. And you look back at the early 2000s, which is the NHS I qualified into in 2003, and you think, my goodness, if they had the resources now, what would they do? That's quite scary to think. And what we had then, that's the risk we've got. But an optimist might say, well, no, because actually general practice always survives. You know, neighbourhood models and the emperor's new clothes, they come and go. But this is the emperor's new clothes because there's no money to make it happen. We're already hearing whispers that there aren't going to be any further waves to the National Neighbourhood Health Implementation Plan and that multi-level provider neighbourhood models might be bumped to the next election, you know, after the next election. Will Labour even get elected next time? There's real uncertainty. So I think we also need to be quite hard-nosed at holding on to what we've got. And a really lovely, wise GP that I'm very fond of always said, you know what, politicians come and go. The patients are still going to be there on Monday morning with my amazing team. I'm going to try and do the best I can. They can't take that away from us. But in the meantime, we're going to have to be quite savvy and intelligent around how we tackle this and try and bring our patients with us. And I think the biggest thing is helping patients understand what they actually want to do to general practice and what an immense loss that would be. Because if you lose the gatekeeper, you lose free at the point of service. And I think there are more and more GPs looking over at the Republic of Ireland and seeing those business models and how they work and thinking, actually, is it that difficult? There's more and more private GPs popping up. And it's not because they want to go private. They don't want to make lots of money there. It's because the status quo within the NHS feels to be quite a toxic place if you're a GP. And isn't that such a shame, because it didn't need to be like this?
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time, Katie. It's been great to talk to you again.
Always great to talk to you, Emma.
Well, that's it for this week. Thanks again to Katie, and thank you for listening. I'll be back next week for our regular news review, so please join me then. Don't forget you can keep up to date with all the latest news affecting general practice and access lots of other resources on our website at GPonline.com.